The water came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Imagine standing on a ridge somewhere in what is now East Africa 20,000 years ago, watching the sky turn the color of wet ash. The air smells like iron. Somewhere below, a river that has fed your people for generations is rising inch by inch, swallowing the trail your grandmother once walked to gather roots. This isn't a single storm. This is a season, and this season will not end for months. Most of us think of prehistoric survival as a battle against cold, against predators, against hunger. We picture cave paintings, spears, fire. We rarely picture rain. But for early humans scattered across the tropics and monsoon belts of the ancient world, water falling from the sky for weeks without pause was just as deadly as any saber-toothed cat. It rotted stored food. It flooded shelters. It turned solid ground into mud that swallowed footprints, tools, even people. And somehow, against all of that, our ancestors didn't just survive it, they learned to read it, predict it, and eventually use it. So here's a mystery worth asking. How did a species with no waterproof clothing, no umbrellas, no concrete walls, make it through entire seasons of relentless rain, and places where a single flash flood could erase a camp overnight? To understand that, we have to go back, not to the flood itself, but to the world before it, when rain was still a stranger. For most of human evolutionary history, our ancestors lived in relatively dry savannas and woodlands in Africa. Early hominins like Australopithecus were creatures of open grassland, not tropical downpour. Their bodies weren't built for constant wet cold. Human skin has almost no natural waterproofing. Unlike a duck or an otter, we have no oil glands dense enough to shed water for long. Get a human wet and cold for long enough, and hypothermia can set in even in what feels like mild weather. That vulnerability should have been a serious evolutionary problem the moment humans began migrating into rain-heavy regions like Southeast Asia, the Congo Basin, and coastal India. And yet, they went anyway. Around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, as Homo sapiens pushed out of Africa and along the southern coastlines of Asia, they walked directly into some of the wettest environments on Earth, monsoon systems that dump more rain in a single season than most of Europe sees in a decade. This wasn't a detour, it was one of the main highways of human migration, which means the earliest waves of modern humans leaving Africa had to solve the rain problem almost immediately, or they simply wouldn't have made it past the first wet season. Here's the strange part. For a long time, archaeologists assumed early humans just endured bad weather the way animals do, sheltering passively until it passed. But excavations over the last 2 decades tell a very different story. At sites like Jwalapuram in southern India, dated to before and after the massive Toba volcanic eruption roughly 74,000 years ago, researchers found stone tool traditions that persisted through dramatic climate shifts, including intensified monsoon periods. The tools didn't just survive, they evolved, which suggests something more than luck was going on. It suggests active adaptation. One of the first strategies wasn't shelter at all. It was timing. Ancient human groups appear to have developed an intimate, almost calendar-like awareness of seasonal rain cycles. Ethno-archaeological studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups living in monsoon regions, like some communities in the Andaman Islands and parts of tropical Africa, show a pattern that likely echoes deep into prehistory. Groups relocate before the heaviest rains arrive, moving from lowlands river camps to higher, better-drained ground. They aren't reacting to the storm, they're anticipating it, based on subtle cues, the behavior of insects, the flowering of specific plants, shifts in wind direction weeks in advance. That kind of forecasting isn't instinct, it's accumulated, transmitted knowledge, passed down over dozens of generations, which means one of humanity's first real technologies wasn't a tool at all. It was memory. But timing alone couldn't save you once the water actually arrived. You still needed somewhere dry to be. This is where the archaeological record gets genuinely surprising. For decades, the popular image of prehistoric shelter was the deep cave, and caves absolutely mattered. Sites like the Naya Caves in Borneo, occupied by modern humans as far back as around 45,000 years ago, show long-term habitations specifically chosen for protection from the region's extreme rainfall. The cave mouth acted like a natural roof, sheltering hearths and living floors from the tropical downpours outside, while still allowing smoke to escape. But not everyone had a convenient cave nearby. And here's what nobody realized until relatively recent excavation work. Early humans were also building deliberate, engineered shelters in open, rain-heavy environments, something once thought far too sophisticated for that era. At sites in Central Africa and parts of Southeast Asia, archaeologists have found patterns of post holes and structured debris, suggesting lean-to and domed shelters, likely covered with large leaves, bark sheets, or woven plant material, angled specifically to shed water rather than collect it. This is a detail that easily gets lost in a documentary, but should stop you in your tracks. Early humans weren't just hiding from the rain, they were engineering against it, thinking in terms of runoff and drainage tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote the word architecture. Then there's fire, which becomes almost unbelievably difficult in prolonged wet seasons. Green wood doesn't burn. Dry tinder disappears within hours of a downpour. Yet hearths at rain-exposed sites show continuous use across wet seasons, which tells us something remarkable. Communities were pre-storing dry fuel before the rains hit, tucking bark, dried grass, and resinous wood into the driest parts of their shelters, essentially stockpiling fire itself the way you or I might stockpile canned food before a hurricane. And that's when everything about this story shifts from survival to strategy. Because heavy rain, once you can control shelter and fire, stops being purely a threat and starts being a resource. Flooded rivers meant fish trapped in shallow pools, easy to catch by hand. Saturated ground meant tubers and roots were far easier to dig up than in dry, compacted soil. Some of the richest, most concentrated food gathering of the entire year in tropical regions happened not despite the rain, but because of it. Isotopic analysis of ancient human remains from monsoon-affected regions shows dietary spikes in aquatic and wetland resources correlating with wet seasons, meaning people weren't just hunkering down and waiting, they were actively exploiting the flood. There's a darker side to the story too, though. Not every group made it through. Sediment layers at several prehistoric sites across South and Southeast Asia show sudden abandonment corresponding with catastrophic flood events. Entire camps buried under meters of silt almost instantly. Some of what we know about how people lived comes only because they didn't survive long enough to move the evidence. In a strange way, the disasters that ended some communities are exactly what preserved the details of daily prehistoric life for us to find tens of thousands of years later. What's genuinely humbling is how much of this knowledge nearly disappeared entirely, over and over in every generation. There was no writing, no maps, no stored data beyond what a person could remember and physically demonstrate to a child. Every single flood survival technique, every shelter design, every rule about which plants signaled the coming rains had to be relearned, retaught, and re-earned by every new generation, with catastrophic consequences if that transmission ever broke. And here's where it connects to something you might not expect. We tend to think of resilience to climate as a modern engineering problem. Dams, drainage systems, weather satellites, but the underlying human behaviors are strikingly similar to what our ancestors were doing 60,000 years ago. Anticipate the pattern before it arrives, build structures that respect water instead of fighting it, store resources before scarcity or danger hits, pass the knowledge forward so it doesn't have to be reinvented from zero. Modern flood-prone communities in places like Bangladesh and parts of Indonesia still use elevated stilt housing, seasonal relocation, and generational rain forecasting knowledge that would be instantly recognizable to a human standing in a Southeast Asian monsoon 45,000 years ago. The technology has changed. The underlying human strategy really hasn't. So when you think about prehistoric humans, don't just picture spears and mammoths. Picture a species walking directly into some of the wettest, most punishing environments on the planet, with nothing but memory, cooperation, and the willingness to watch the sky closely enough to read it like a language. They didn't beat the rain by being stronger than it. They beat it by paying attention. And in a strange way, that ridge overlooking the rising river, the one you imagine standing on at the very beginning, isn't so different from where we're standing now, watching the same skies, still trying to read what's coming next.